talk about the latest updates in the digital ecosystem. I spoke at a community event a few months ago outlining what was happening in this particular space when it comes to Australia bringing in legislation where the agreements around the IMF are incorporated into domestic legislation here in Australia. Let me show you why.
Safety in the title of your organisation, what does safety mean to you?
Well, great. I've been working in the safety space since about 1995, when I was hired by Microsoft to be one of their first lobbyists. In fact, I was working at the intersection of technology, policy, and social justice in Washington, D.C. before there was an internet. I happened to work for my hometown congressman on Capitol Hill and was working on a range of social issues. He put his head over my cubicle and said, "We've got this small company called Microsoft in our electorate. Can you work on these issues too?" So that was an interesting intersection. We're seeing a little bit of a tech moral panic happening now. And what I've observed over the past 30 years in this field is about every 5 or 10 years, there's a new tech moral panic. I mean, we're all too young to remember, that when the radio created a tech moral panic, and the TV, and I'm sure the printing press did too. But it was often the fear of pedophiles being able to reach young people was what sort of spurred on congressional consideration of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. Now, this was a time when the internet was in its infancy. The players then, I was working for Microsoft, but it was AOL, Alta Vista, Netscape, Novell. Many of these companies no longer exist. But we were truly afraid that if the internet was overtaxed, there were about 50 different e-commerce bills pending before Commerce, and overregulated, then it would really stop the promise and the growth of the internet in its tracks. And Section 230 was the way that we now know, giving these companies intermediary immunity for any of the bad conduct or content users were creating on the platforms. What's important to know about that is this was about a decade before social media. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg was probably around 12 and probably more concerned about building his next Dungeons and Dragon adventure than the world's largest social network. And so this is still in place today. And it is a primary reason governments really haven't been able to put a brake on the harms that we've seen. So when I think about safety, I think about how we're talking really about personal harms that the interaction or facilitation that technology provides when that conduct, content, or contact can go wrong.
I think that's a really useful contextualisation for people to recognise that this is something that governments have been considering from different angles for some time, but that it's in a changing technology landscape. In terms of the past 12 months for your agency, it's obviously been very busy. You've made use of a broad range of the different regulatory tools and regulatory powers that you have available under legislation, which include things like transparency notices, removal notices, and also there've been some civil penalty proceedings that have been commenced. And I want to come back to the high-profile engagements that you've had with X. But the other enforcement tools that you've been using as well are equally important, and there have been a lot of transparency notices that have been issued. And the information that you've gathered through the transparency notices, you then use to provide information to the public and produce reports. Is the light that you are able to shine through that transparency notice procedure a significant or a sufficient disinfectant for the type of conduct that you're seeing? Are you seeing changes by companies as a result of the use of those powers?
The short answer is yes. And if you go back to Justice Brandeis and sunlight being the best disinfectant, I think that's certainly true in the case of the technology sector. So, I mean, we have to keep in mind, we were the first country in the world to have such and use these kinds of transparency powers. Now, the European Commission, through the Digital Services Act, has started to utilize their transparency powers, but they're quite different, and I'll explain the differences. Again, companies put out transparency reports, but they are spun in a certain way. They don't get very deep. There are questions we were asking these technology companies to try and explain to us why we saw so many disparities. For instance, in the way that why does Meta have 27 million reports to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, but Apple only has 267? Well, it was pretty obvious it's because Apple is not detecting or wanting to deal with child sexual abuse material. But we really needed to understand more about the how and the why. You cannot hold a company accountable if they're not transparent. So while governments are very much focused on transparency, we're starting to see companies become, by design, much more opaque. So if you think about the new ownership of then Twitter, now X Corp, one of the first things that was done was to take the Twitter API, what we used to refer to as the Twitter data hose, that was used by researchers and academics and NGOs to be able to test the toxicity and the sentiment analysis on these tools. That was put out of reach, $40,000 US a month. So really no NGO or research organization could afford that. Companies like Reddit followed suit. Then we saw Meta acquire CrowdTangle, which was probably one of the best social media monitoring tools that was out there. After about 2 years, they announced they were deprecating it or basically killing the product. And that has led to quite a bit of consternation, including a potential action by the European Commission around that. So we're seeing all of these efforts. Vexatious litigation is also being used. You know, if you criticize a particular company, then they will try and silence you through litigation. And some of the SLAPP laws in California have been used to kind of undermine that. So in terms of how we use our transparency powers, we do a lot of research and we try and be very surgical and prescriptive about the questions that we ask, so that we're not giving them 300 questions. We're giving them very targeted questions they don't always want to answer. And they have to respond in the manner and form which we require, which again which does not enable them to spin the answers. We need a lot of specificity in terms of the information we're working through. There's a lot of fairness and due diligence built into the process. And then we end up summarizing what they have said. We, of course, check it with them and give them plenty of time. So we've had 2 cases of noncompliance. We issued Google with a service provider notification, but we've also issued X Corp with a service provider notification, but also fined them. One of the issues before the court is a judicial review around the transparency notice around what they were doing to combat child sexual abuse material. And of course, the infringement was not paid. So we're seeking civil penalty action there.
And those proceedings are ongoing before the court at the moment. Without giving too much away about your enforcement strategy, has the experience that you've had in the issuing of those infringement notices informed the way that you will conduct enforcement action going forward?
I mean, I think it's going to be a question, and it is a question for every digital regulator. So we just happen to be at the pointy end of this. And we can talk about Wakely later, but when we issued the formal removal notice, all of the other companies complied without a formal removal notice. We did issue one to Meta and X Corp, and their responses couldn't have been more different. Meta responded within an hour and kept us up to date on how they were banking and continuing to remove the content. And of course, you saw that Elon Musk said, "Well, we'll see you in court." So I think this is going to be something that we're going to see more of. Mr. Musk has also threatened to take the European Commission to court for some preliminary findings they had around noncompliance with the Digital Services Act. So I'd say that there are going to be different categories of players, some that are much more recalcitrant and are very resistant to compliance. But the vast majority of larger companies that have shareholders and want to maintain an advertising base and keep users on board will largely comply. I mean, we've had this issue for years and years, particularly with rogue porn sites and gore sites that are set up purely for the purposes of hosting child sexual abuse and for terror content. And there are hosting sites above them that are also maybe bulletproof or resistant to takedown.
And I think that with the Wakely example that you've given there was court action that was taken about the failure to remove that content, and there was an injunction that was granted that required that takedown, which was then reconsidered by the court. I understand that that enforcement action is continuing as part of the judicial review action. Is that right?
Well, we have 6 different cases that Twitter has brought or X Corp has brought. There will be consideration before the AAT around some of the issues that were present in Wakely, and frankly, seeing what we're seeing now with social media continuing to foment division, to propel mis and disinformation, and threaten online abuse. I mean, the Director General of ASIO raising the threat level to probable. This is all something we've been seeing for a while. So I think we did the right thing in terms of saying, hey, listen, our job is to protect Australians from seeing illegal and harmful content that likely violates your own, policies around free speech. You've just globally deleted 40 pieces of Israel-Hamas content because that's what companies do when illegal content is concerned. And of course, their servers are based in California. They don't have servers in Australia. So I think that was the right call. So that one of those issues will be looked at in terms of the notification process. I think it raises some really other important issues. 2021, when the Online Safety Act was being reviewed before, we recommended to the then government that our consideration and classification of online violent live stream content be divorced from the classification scheme, and that a new harms-based regime be set up for that purpose, because the classification board is very good at what they do, but they were set up to classify produced films and books and music, which is very different from user-generated content that is illegal in nature and designed to go viral. So that's one of the issues that was raised. And then, interestingly, in the interlocutory injunction, the whole idea of a comity of nations, which probably didn't belong there, but it really wasn't, we felt, the place for the Federal Court of Australia to make certain determinations. And this is why we're engaging quite a bit internationally with organizations like the Council of Europe and the OECD and others. And perhaps we actually need something akin to a Bretton Woods for digital takedown, because I think it's unlikely that the United States is going to legislate to really hold these American-based companies to account. And part of the challenge has been the U.S. and the First Amendment creates a very permissive hosting environment for illegal and harmful content to thrive. So jurisdiction will always be an issue. I think what the reviewer will be looking at in the context of the Online Safety Act review is what our enforcement powers look like. So this really laid bare, one, how the quantum of fines is relatively low, particularly vis-a-vis the UK Online Safety Bill and the EU's Digital Services Act, where they can fine them, 6 to 10% of overall global turnover, and we're talking $782,000 a day. And we've also found over time that it isn't just regulation that motivates a company to do better and do more. It's really the reputation and the potential hit to revenue that will make them make meaningful changes. And so back to your earlier question about have we seen an impact from the transparency notices? Yes, I think we have. In fact, one of the first companies we queried was Omegle. As a result of that kind of regulatory scrutiny and also litigation, they've actually shut down shop. And it was a really terrible site that was purely set up to set up children with interested adults. So it was really a pedophile's paradise. There was no other purpose for it. So it's gone. We've seen some other really important changes that some of these companies have made as a result of these transparency notices, and the naming and shaming elements do make a difference. What we've done most recently is just introduced our first set of periodic notices. So frankly, I was disappointed that we'd surfaced up some really significant safety shortcomings from Apple, from Microsoft, from Google, and Meta. And we will be asking specific questions about those shortcomings and what kind of progress they have made. So again, it's about shining an even brighter and more targeted spotlight on real safety inadequacies that can and should be addressed.
And using the time series to get a consistent set of data so that people can see how practices are changing over time.
Yep.
The other thing that I've noticed about the transparency reports that you have published is that it enables Australians to understand the comparative position of different companies. Do you think that we're also seeing, as a result of your use of those powers and the publication of those reports, changes in behaviours by consumers as well?
I hope so. I don't know how many of the average Australians really dig into the transparency reports, but I think what's important about our regulatory model is that we have these systemic powers, that these transparency powers are complemented with our mandatory codes and standards. We have the complaint schemes so that we can remediate harm in real time when children are being cyberbullied, when someone's intimate images are shared online without consent, and that includes the sexual extortion of young men. We've got an adult cyber abuse scheme, which is, again, very novel and targeted at a high threshold. And then the online content scheme, which is where we're taking in the pro-terror and child sexual abuse content. Those protections are bolstered on the front end through prevention. So we've got extensive education materials, a body of research that doesn't really exist anywhere else in the world around technology usage, things like ESafety guides, parents' guides, grandparents' guides, specific content for young people and vulnerable communities, so that we want to have that prevention as a key front pillar to prevent the harms from happening in the first place, the protection through the regulatory schemes. And all of those are enshrined in the Online Safety Act. What I felt was missing when I came into this role is what I call proactive and systemic change. There was really nothing in the legislation that sought to look at the upstream challenges and to place the burden for safety back on the platforms themselves. So this is where the Safety by Design initiative was spawned in 2018. It was something I decided to do with industry rather than to industry, and I can talk about that. But the work that we do around technology horizon scanning and our tech trends and challenges series is meant for us to be more of an anticipatory regulator and get ahead of the issues and to help bring the public along. So 2020, we did our first one on deep fakes. We were just a little bit too early. We were so early that no one in the mainstream media would pick it up. But everything we predicted could happen, unfortunately, has happened, and it's all coming to roost now. But thankfully, because we did that work, we were able to shape the Online Safety Act of 2021 to ensure that all of our regulatory schemes covered deep fakes. And so we're able, and we've also taken action against an Australian man who has created a range of deep fake imagery, or image-based abuse, as we call it, rather than deep fake porn, of prominent Australian women.
I think that's a really interesting point to then launch into the trend that we're seeing more generally amongst regulators, having a very strong enforcement stance. And we'll hear a bit later from the OEIC about that. But also the role that regulators are playing in shaping not only what the digital landscape looks like now, but having views on what that should look like. Where do you see the agency's role and your role in that reform debate, in the policy debate, as well as in relation to taking action about what's happening now?
Right. Well, it's really interesting to see Carly Kine stepping into the privacy commissioner's role, because when I was first appointed, I was considered, I suppose, a little bit of an oddity. I was an outsider in every way. Being American born and coming from the tech sector, I had worked in government, but in the U.S. legislative branch. And when I came in and I sort of saw the scaffolding that had been left for me and the staffing profile, it was 35 people. We're now 210, which is still small for a regulator taking on the wealth, the self, and power of the entire technology industry. But it was the first time that a regulator had done things in different ways. And I think ways that have been effective, but were not common. And so there was really a bit of initial resistance to the way that things were being done. But, Carly has a background, obviously in law and in privacy, but she came from the Ada Lovelace Institute. And so she's been doing a lot of thinking about AI for a long time. And while I've been talking about safety by design for 6 years, it's now really catching on globally. And, tech trends and challenges. I'm hearing similar refrains from her about privacy by design, because I think it makes sense. I think now people are catching up to the fact that the fundamental building blocks of these platforms and services are not safe, private, and secure. Regulation is only going to provide, through takedowns, a whack-a-mole approach. I think it's really important that we do that because we're remediating harms to Australians, particularly when platforms fail to act. But I think there needs to be a recognition that we have to do things on multiple fronts to really make people safer online. And we need to be smarter and if not a step ahead of the technology industry, at least in tandem with them and being able to anticipate their next moves.
And I'll come back to technological developments in a moment, but just picking on something else that you said earlier, Julie, about the importance of a global approach or a global awareness of these issues. And you mentioned, the difficulty in enforcing against global platforms. To what extent can you seek an outcome that might be global in its scope or its effect, or that could go beyond Australia's boundaries in a world where Australia's sensibilities and standards of material could be different? You've made a direct comparison to the US and a view about the likelihood that the US might regulate on certain things. But do you see this as an opportunity for Australia to continue to lead in ESafety?
Oh, absolutely. And part of this proactive and systemic change function that I built included an international division. And so really what we did in the earlier days before there were other regulators, and it was seven years until and really last year with the emergence of AI into the mainstream that governments finally acted in 2023. Other governments, we spent a lot of time doing capacity building, talking to a range of governments around the world about how we set up, how our functions work. So we did a lot of that work. Once we knew that other countries were coming on board, now Fiji set up an online safety commissioner. Ireland has done so, and then last year the online safety bill in the UK finally passed. I went to all of these countries and said, hey, listen, there's a Global Privacy Assembly. There's ICPEN for competition enforcers. We need an online safety body that's similar. So we set up the Global Online Safety Regulators Network, and in November 2022, we announced it in Washington, D.C. With the UK, Fiji, and Ireland. And it was very deliberate to do it in DC. And I've had lots of discussions with the White House, lots of discussions with members of Congress. Again, a very different environment. The discussions around online safety are much more political, much more polarized. It's really more about the constraining or the censorship of conservative versus progressive voices, whereas in Australia, there might be differences across the parties in terms of how we get certain places, but there's been really unanimity. It's been a very bipartisan issue in terms of saying, of course, we want to promote freedom of expression, but we want to draw a line. And when online discourse, goes into the realm of suppressing other voices through targeted online harassment, we do want an independent regulator to draw the line. So with the Global Online Safety Regulators Network, we chaired the first year. One of the first things we did was grow the network to about 8 regulators, and we have an observers network. And that includes countries that want to set up online safety regulators but don't have one yet. And then we did a statement on how online safety is compatible with human rights. This year, the UK Ofcom has taken on the chair. They've grown the network further, and we've been very much focused on what we call regulatory coherence. Really, an acceptance that you're never going to have cookie cutter legislation or regulation from country to country. I mean, these are created by politicians. There are going to be different policy and regulatory frameworks and approaches, but trying to at least help these companies understand where there are levels of commonality. That also means where, for instance, 3 or 4 of us we're doing codes making powers in the same way. We're trying to build off each other. We all have transparency powers that work slightly differently. So we're trying to leverage the knowledge that we're getting from each of these other organizations in these countries and to build on each other. And I think that's the only way we're going to make progress. We've just signed an MOU with the European Commission so that we can share more information and do joint work.
And it's really interesting to hear, Julie, you speak about the importance of regulatory coherence and a common understanding between those agencies. Do you also see a role for the Office of the ESafety Commissioner in helping with capacity building in smaller countries who may not have the same resources?
Oh, absolutely. We've spent a lot of time in Fiji, for instance. We've spent years and years developing research instruments and education materials. So, for instance, when COVID happened, this was interesting. It was the Queen of Sweden has a foundation called the World Childhood Foundation. They were talking to the World Health Organization and the CDC and others about, as we were all kind of locked in at home, how do we get information out to parents and teachers about how to teach kids online safely? And they identified ESafety's resources as the best in breed out there. So we always develop with Australians in mind in the Australian context. What we actually did is we almost internationalized it or made it more generic so it could be used anywhere. And those were shared by multinational organizations out globally.
And at exactly the right moment as well. So another big theme for our Digital Futures Summit is trust, and nowhere is that more present or important in terms of what we're seeing online and what we're reading and the images that we see. So obviously artificial intelligence is really important there, and particularly the challenges that you've mentioned about seeing artificially created images. What are you seeing and what do you think needs to happen in that space?
Right. Well, it kind of hit us all like a ton of bricks. Of course, artificial intelligence has been around for decades, but in terms of reaching the mainstream, it was really what I call the AI drag race of 2023. We often talk about the former meta mantra of moving fast and breaking things in the social media era. We saw exactly the same thing around AI in terms of jockeying for position, in terms of very strategic investment by some of the larger companies into promising AI startups like OpenAI and Mistral AI in France, for instance. We've seen some interesting splitting off or siphoning. You know, there was the board spill at OpenAI, and then there were the two members of the super alignment team who kind of look after safety, who recently left OpenAI to start as sort of more, I suppose, what they would consider benevolent or safer set of AI large language models. We saw Anthropic break off and those founders. And then we've got, of course, Grok, which is the politically incorrect chatbot. So we're seeing a lot of that. We've been focused most recently through our standards, which we've worked with KWM on open source AI. These are, and we're seeing a lot of things like nudifying apps or undressing apps. They have no guardrails on them, and they don't actually have a brand behind them in many respects that would encourage them to use safety by design as a building ethos.
They don't have the same reputational driver.
Nope, they don't. In fact, some of them are created for nefarious purposes, like these nudifying apps. And the platforms and libraries that host them, you can think of them like the app stores of the AI open source world. They have very inconsistent terms of services. Some of them don't have reporting mechanisms so that they can suspend, but there needs to be accountability and safeguarding up and down the track. So our standards will help put some requirements in there, particularly to prevent these kind of open source AI apps being used to generate child sexual abuse material or synthetic pro-terror content. So it's kind of a scary world because even 3 or 4 years ago, to create a convincing deep fake, you needed a lot of images of the same person, which is why celebrities were targeted. You needed technological skills and you needed a lot of computing power. Now you have these very powerful AI apps on your smartphone, like I said, without guardrails. And it's cost the predator or, even a young teenage boy who wants to nudify his classmates, costs them nothing, but the cost is incalculable and lingering to those people who are impacted. And and this is where not even honing your critical reasoning skills is going to make a difference. And so what we see here is what we often see in terms of technology development. If you think about this potentially being a poison, they're really behind on creating the antidote. So there's probably about 10 companies now that are just up and coming that are focusing on deepfake detection. There's some great industry efforts around the Content Authenticity Initiative, where they're developing a standard around AI watermarking. But again, with this moving fast and breaking things mentality, safety is always a secondary or tertiary concern, and we need that to change. Safety has to be a consideration through every part of the design, development, and deployment process, from choosing the data, from training the data, deployment and everything else. And, it is disappointing that we haven't learned lessons from the past.
It's interesting how you describe that as the drag race of last year. Looking forward a little bit, there's been a lot of talk about the next wave of technological developments or technology developments and the introduction of Web 3.0, making it even harder to detect and to protect online. Is that something that the ESafety Commission is already looking ahead to?
Right. I think we actually put a tech trends brief out at esafety.gov.au on decentralization or DWeb or Web 3.0, and thought that and sort of blockchain would become much more commonplace earlier on, but the whole idea is that it is a decentralized internet, that the tech titan gatekeepers are disintermediated to a certain degree, and that communities and groups will decide what is acceptable or not acceptable. It would sort of undermine the whole notice and takedown kind of model, and it diffuses accountability. So if we did move totally to that world, I don't know what kind of anarchy we would see. There's a utopian element to it that assumes the best. So we're keeping an eye on that. I mean, we're not trying to stop innovation from happening, but I think, again, we have to be mindful of the challenges there. And then when you layer on immersive technologies and what I call invasive technologies, we've got a really complex digital architecture that we're going to have to start regulating. The debate has become a little bit more sophisticated in some corners here about algorithms, which we've also done a tech trends brief on recommender systems and also generative AI. And in order to really regulate those, you need to do technical auditing, and you need capacity and capability, and you need the right kinds of tools and people to be able to do that. So we're entering a much more difficult era. And I'm seeing some of the same trends in immersive technologies, which, again, we thought the metaverse was really going to come into the mainstream probably 2 years ago. And I remember being in a meeting with very senior executives from these companies saying, we'll worry about safety and security later. We need to achieve interoperability and figure out how to monetize this. And I'm like, I just said, if you're building a city in a desert, you think about where the green spaces are going to be. You want it to be pleasant and habitable. You want to put your water sources away from the sewage, and you need to strategically put lighting and sidewalks and bollards. When you're building, you need to think about safety and harms and how you protect the inhabitants and create a pleasant place. If you just build and wait for that to happen later, you're not going to get a safer online world. And why it really matters is, with immersive technologies, and there are lots of developments in terms of haptics, teledildonics, which are connected sex toys. You've got the headsets. These things are happening in real time, so it's hyper realistic and high sensory. 46% of women who have been in the metaverse have had something akin to a sexual assault. And when it's hyper realistic like this, your body reacts like it would another trauma, and it gets lodged in your hippocampus, and people display the same forms of trauma that you might expect because it feels real. So we need companies thinking about how we put in those personal boundary perimeters, and how you might hit something more akin to an eject button rather than a report abuse button. So how do we build those protections in now?
I'm Gary Fitazzi. Follow if you want to find out more about the digital transformation space. Comment if you found the video interesting, and hit the link in my bio to follow all my socials.